she has a great deal of agency in this story that I feel like we haven't seen in iterations of the past. Like there is a real yearning coming from her side as well. And somebody said to me,
I like Nosferatu, I do. I like Orlok, I like the actors and their performances, I like the attention to detail in the presentation. Even still, something about the film left me cold. My main complaint about Nosferatu is that it's mostly redundant. The film takes themes and ideas that were already present in the previous iterations, and in typical modern fashion, strips them of all their subtlety. Where before Hooter or Harker's sexual defilement at the hands of the Count was implied in subtext, here it's writ large in Orlok's naked thrusting pelvis. While sex, desire, and repression has always been a through line with both the previous versions of Nosferatu and the Dracula story in general, the sort of porn-brained aesthetic of this newer iteration kind of makes me wish Ellen had been more repressed. Meanwhile, a lot of what might be considered new or different about the film, this modern zeitgeistal tapestry of sex, repression, shame, and predation, a lot of it comes across as muddled and confused, despite the film's best efforts to read its thesis aloud to the class. In Eggers' Nosferatu, there's a marked increase in exposition. This is a very talky film. It should be no wonder the film has inspired so much discussion, so much media literacy, because there's hardly a moment when the film isn't telling you exactly what it wants you to talk about, exactly what the characters are feeling. "He is my shame," Ellen cries about Orlok, in case you weren't clear on that yet. Granted, Eggers is known for his dialogue. The dialogue itself is well written and it's delivered well by the actors, but then it doesn't leave much on the table. In each version of Nosferatu is a scene where Ellen, or Lucy, sits on the beach as she waits for Thomas's return. The effectiveness of these scenes is that the images communicate more than the words ever could. The vast, unknowable sea helps to visualize Lucy's loneliness and her longing, her connection to the natural and the good. The crosses and the gravestones on shore point to tradition and spiritual grounding in the face of vast uncertainty. They allude to Lucy's connection with death. Meanwhile, in the newer iteration, Ellen babbles her way through the scene. Stillness and meditation are replaced by restlessness and histrionics. It's different, sure. You can say Eggers is setting his sights on standing apart from the previous iterations. I just don't think it works as well, and kind of defeats the whole purpose of the scene. To me, there's more pathos, there's much more to chew on in Isabelle Adjani's melancholy stare out the window, in her silent walking along the beach, than all of Lily-Rose Depp's drooling and babbling. Robert Eggers has styled himself as this sort of anti-modernist, the guy who pays close attention to folklore, to period accuracy, the guy who blanches at the idea of filming a car or a cell phone. Aesthetically, Eggers might be the anti-modernist, but thematically I'm not so sure. Eggers' approach to the concept of a divine feminine, for instance, is turned more toward the modern. In his version of the film, Ellen's connection with the mystic is bound up in her libido. Ellen's sexuality can conjure and vanquish demons. It's described by both Orlok and von Franz, for good and for ill, as her nature. She's described as both an enchantress and a great priestess of Isis. Whether we should believe them when they say all that is another matter entirely, because elsewhere Eggers weaves such a tapestry of patriarchal repression that even the necessity of Ellen's sacrifice might be called into question. Ellen says it's her father's shame that led her to call on Orlok in the first place. It's shame which opens Ellen to predation by Orlok, assumably twisting and deforming her sexuality. But then how do you square this story of trauma and abuse with all the romanticism and sexual affirmation? Is it simply a case of women do be like that? It's admittedly hard to analyze the film divorced from the culture into which it arrives, where for some, their main takeaway from the film is how sexy the relationship between Ellen and Orlok is, and where even the film's own star describes her role as empowering.
Somebody said to me in an interview the other day, well, isn't Ellen like this victim? Like, what is it like to play this kind of like victimized character? And I was like, well, I don't think she's a victim at all, because she's kind of calling the shots the entire time. She calls out to him. She has a great deal of agency in this story that I feel like we haven't seen in iterations of the past.
If Eggers' intention is in fact a sort of old-world pagan interpretation of the divine feminine, an association between nature, sex, and mysticism, then it's majorly diminished by all of Lily-Rose Depp's very modern, very brained, drooling, and writhing around. It's also convenient that this rendition of the divine feminine as divine libido also largely sidesteps conception and the creation of life. You know, the thing that often happens when people have sex, removed from the modern convenience of birth control. Ellen's friend is pregnant, and yet it never has any bearing on Ellen herself. Like Poor Things, Nosferatu is another example where it's easy to inspire discussion about sex, shame, and repression when you never confront the material realities of pregnancy or sexually transmitted disease. Maybe sometimes shame or discipline are useful, are as much evidence of spiritual and bodily autonomy as is sexual liberation. There's of course the notion that Orlok arrives as a force of consequence, a sentient plague of syphilis conjured by the pitfalls and uglinesses of sexual liberation. So then is the film trying to argue a middle way, where we should rid ourselves of our shame but also be mindful of our excesses? The problem is that liberalism tends to escalate. Today's freedom is tomorrow's repression. What seems excessive now seems necessary tomorrow. More than that, we aren't always able to identify those who might misuse or take advantage of sexual liberation. We can't always clock them ahead of time by their sharp claws and teeth. Or, rather than the dark side of sexuality, is Orlok supposed to represent a sort of festering patriarchy, the consequence of repression? Is he really, as Ellen says, her shame? Where in previous iterations Orlok was positioned as the other, as an outside force come to upend normalcy and tradition, nudging him toward being a force conjured up by patriarchal shame positions him more as the enemy within, a homegrown societal ill. Very modern, if you ask me. To me, it's all very muddled, where it inspires a lot of thinking but not much feeling. The new universal storytelling is a sort of choose-your-own adventure of moral incongruities, less thoughtfully ambiguous than coldly aloof. Meanwhile, Isabelle Adjani as Lucy is, to me, a much more profound articulation of the divine feminine. She's dark, ethereal, heroic, tragic. She's not just some reflex against the patriarchy. She doesn't have Willem Dafoe ranting about how special she is. In Herzog's Nosferatu, the divine feminine is decidedly Christian in origin. Christianity is the method by which the natural order of good and evil is articulated. Lucy's feminine mysticism is articulated in the sprinkling of communion wafers. She's protected by the cross around her neck. Her sacrifice at the end, then, is more in line with Christian theology, while at the same time is, in my opinion, much more heroic, much more empowering. She sacrifices herself without Orlok threatening her with the 3-day thing. She does so without Willem Dafoe egging her on. In Egger's version, meanwhile, Ellen makes a point of denying the Christian connotation of her sacrifice, saying that she needs no salvation and that she has done no evil but heed her nature. It's interesting how throughout the film, Eggers skirts having Orlok come into any direct conflict with Christianity. Thomas is given a cross but rips it off. Ellen is given one as well but does who knows what with it. It's interesting that, for how often Orlok is described as the devil, no character thinks to confront him with his opposite. Ellen maintains her atheistic streak. Von Franz maintains some Nietzschean concept of a god beyond good and evil, calling on both angels and demons to protect them. The more religiously minded Harding family is torn to pieces, so maybe that's meant to be the result of the conflict between the vampire and the cross. The original 1922 version of Nosferatu doesn't have as much of the religious iconography that the 79 version has, and maybe that's what Eggers was going for, cleaving toward the more occult aesthetic of the original. Then again, I can't help but think Eggers might just as well be cleaving toward the modern. After all, sacrifice in service of a Christian god, a capital H he, might be considered foundationally patriarchal, which wouldn't jive with the rest of Eggers' thesis. Lastly is the film's style, that component which everyone, even if they weren't that moved by the film, seems to agree on. Well, at least it looks nice. Well, yeah, it does. The costumes, the sets, the cinematography, there is definitely an eye towards craftsmanship. At the same time, I don't know, I find something kind of hollow about it. The style is very formal, it's very precious, it's The Shining with a dash of Wes Anderson. This sort of art horror aesthetic has become so packaged, so calculated by now, owing in large part to the influence of Eggers' own The Witch, that a lot of it reads like pretense. Soft lights, muted colors, lots of steadicam. Many have used the word dreamlike to describe the film, to describe Thomas's trip to Orlok's castle, but again I find this applies to Herzog's version much more than it does Eggers's, and so again there's a sort of redundancy, and in terms of sheer stylistic spectacle there's still no real topping Coppola's Dracula. There are times when it feels like Eggers is floundering for something artsy to do with his camera. The scene is always transitioning on a dolly or a pan, and sometimes it just doesn't flow or the transition seems arbitrary. I think in some instances that sense of spatial disorientation might be argued as intentional, but at other times, I don't know. Beyond that, the pacing seems erratic at times. Thomas's journey to Orlok's castle, as well as the ending, seems rushed, while more focus is placed on Ellen's babbling. Anyway, I think that's all I have to say about Nosferatu for the time being. Again, I did like the movie in general, but I think people need to calm down. There's always this very sort of hyperbolic response to a lot of these films, and it's just, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Anyway, let me know what you think. Subscribe if so inclined. I write books if you like books. I'll put the links to those down below. Okay, goodbye.